Hi folks, welcome to RJ Impact. Today we're going to be finding out how Sam Bankman-Fried finds himself facing his first night in jail, despite earlier in the year having been awarded bail, albeit on a $250 million bond. I'm intending this to be a standalone video or synopsis, and so I'll give a brief history of the events, focusing on how Sam Bankman-Fried finds himself spending his first night in jail. So yes, we'll get to the internet abuse and the alleged harassment of Caroline Ellison in due course. So Sam Bankman-Fried was the founder of the cryptocurrency exchange FTX, and he has had a very public downfall in the last year. In September in 2022, he was arrested and charged with fraud and conspiracy. He was released on bail but confined to his parents' home in Palo Alto, California. After further investigation in February 2023, he was indicted on additional charges. Now, in August 2023, as I'm writing this, his bail has been revoked after he's been accused of tampering with witnesses, and therefore he is currently in jail awaiting trial. So the charges against him stem from his alleged use of FTX to defraud investors. Prosecutors allege that he lied about the company's financial health and used customers' funds to prop up its failing operations. Bankman-Fried has denied the charges and pleaded not guilty. The wider impact of the collapse of FTX and the arrest of Bankman-Fried has been a major blow to the cryptocurrency industry in general, because FTX was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world, and Bankman-Fried was one of the most prominent figures in the industry. So his downfall has actually shaken investor confidence, which is an understatement in cryptocurrency, and has raised questions about the regulation of the industry in general. From Bankman-Fried's perspective, however, it's clear he's fallen from grace in a very public fashion, going from one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world to being a defendant in a high-profile criminal case. A cautionary tale about the risks of cryptocurrency and the dangers of unchecked greed. A quick timeline of his downfall so I can put a visual up. September the 12th, 2022, he's arrested in the Bahamas on charges of fraud and conspiracy. After being voluntarily extradited to the US on December the 22nd, he's released on bail and confined to his parents' home in Palo Alto, California. And on further investigation on February the 14th, 2023, he's indicted on additional charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. And bringing us right up to date on August the 11th, Bankman-Fried's bail is revoked after he's accused of tampering with witnesses. And on August the 12th, he's taken into custody and transported to New York City to await trial. And his trial is scheduled to begin in October the 10th, I believe. He faces up to 115 years in prison if convicted. And the internet abuse that I mentioned, we've already heard about. Sam Bankman-Fried actually used a VPN and reached out to the previous counsel of FTX. He'd actually been warned by the judge about this as being an abuse of his parole terms and conditions, and so was on fairly thin ice already with Judge Kaplan. Fried had essentially said to the counsel, wouldn't it be a good idea if we met up, exchanged stories about what we're going to say, and line things up between ourselves? The counsel was having none of this and went straight to the prosecution to report it. Now, that was a few months ago, and I think Sam Bankman-Fried could count himself lucky that he wasn't put in prison there and then. And it's actually this tampering with witnesses that's caught the headlines in recent days. He gave an interview to a New York Times reporter, during which he gave private writings by his ex-girlfriend Caroline Ellison to the reporter. These were apparently writings from her personal Google Drive account and included diary entries, emails, and other documents, quite a significant number, I believe. Well, I know you're dying to find out what they said. Well, in the writings themselves, Ellison expresses some doubts about her abilities as CEO of Alameda Research. Now, this was a trading firm affiliated with FTX. And as an aside, this was one of the routes that Bankman-Fried is accused of funneling funds from FTX to himself, essentially, and also to cover up significant losses that Alameda Research were incurring. So back to Ellison. She writes about her relationship with Bankman-Fried and describes it as toxic and abusive. What does that actually mean? What does toxic mean? What was the abuse to be abusive? We don't know. So in his defence, Bankman-Fried's lawyers argued that the writings are irrelevant to the fraud case against him, and they were disclosed to the reporter in an attempt to defend himself. However, prosecutors allege that he disclosed the writings in an attempt to harass Caroline Ellison and to dissuade her from testifying against him. It is fair to say that the writings are potentially damaging to Ellison's credibility as a witness. They could also be used by prosecutors to argue that Bankman-Fried had a motive to commit fraud. Whilst there was an awful lot of disclosure, very little has actually been made public. It goes without saying that given that the press are involved, some of the salacious stuff has been published, and I'll quote these here. So as a reminder, this is Caroline writing in her own notes, her own diaries, if you like, to herself. So, I'm not sure I'm cut out for this CEO thing. I'm not sure I'm smart enough or tough enough. Sam is a brilliant guy, but he can also be very controlling and demanding. He's always pushing me to do more, even when I'm already exhausted. Our relationship is toxic. We're always fighting and arguing. I don't know how much longer I can take it. So with those, and we've seen hinted in those anyway, the writings detail Ellison's doubts about her abilities as CEO of Alameda Research and her concerns about Bankman-Fried's financial dealings. So the writings could potentially be used both by prosecutors to argue that Bankman-Fried had a motive to commit fraud. So if Sam Bankman-Fried were trying to aid his defence, it's probably a bit of a double-edged sword. There seems to be enough in there for the prosecution to latch onto, as well as the defence. So who gains in the long term? I'm not sure. We'll find out in due course. Just as an aside, and I've got my own opinions about the press in general, but apparently the New York Times said that they won't publish all of these full writings that are in the documents that were leaked to them by Sam Bankman-Fried because they contain a lot of personal and confidential information, etc. Which all sounds very good until you realise that they just did disclose a lot of personal and confidential information in reporting on it in the first place. Is that what they call an oxymoron? I think it might be. Anyway, when you see this headline, Inside the Private Writings of Caroline Ellison, Star Witness in the FTX Case, it doesn't take a numbskull to realise that they're really just after readership. And just before I sign off this, in case you weren't aware, Ellison's actually quite a prolific writer. Her Tumblr posts about Harry Potter and Jane Austen have been widely dissected, according to the New York Times. Another aside, which seems to fit here somewhat well, is the knowledge we've garnered from the court filings about Ellison's salary. Apparently, she was paid about $6 million. And you might think, well, that's just Sam Bankman-Fried favouring his love interest. Until, that is, you compare that with $587 million that Mr. Singh, FTX's head of engineering, was paid. The short story is that over the last couple of days, Judge Kaplan, presiding over the trial, found that Sam Bankman-Fried had been tampering with the witnesses and therefore, as a violation of parole, he must return to jail. Hence, he sent the orders out for him to be arrested and brought to New York and put in prison or jail. So this latest hullabaloo with Caroline Ellison and the New York Times was really the straw that broke the camel's back. I saw one comment on Twitter where somebody had said that, well, at least the time will count as time served against any eventual sentence. Although you've got to think that Sam Bankman-Fried probably doesn't see any positives in that news right at the moment. It's actually very difficult for me to believe that someone who has such a high profile as Sam Bankman-Fried can think that they could dump a whole host of private, intimate, etc. writings by their ex-girlfriend and somebody who's going to be in court for the prosecution against him into the public domain via a national newspaper and think it won't have any consequences. I mean, he's on bail with very strict court orders about what he can and can't do. To think that this wouldn't have consequences, like going to jail, is just delusional or smacks of hubris of the highest order. Just my thought. And as the hand of subscribe moves towards the bell of notification, it realises it's not the same bell that's going to be waking up Sam Bankman-Fried from now on. Bye for now.